today, and we will share those questions with BEIS afterwards so they can use those to inform their insights going forward. So we're delighted to welcome Tom Davies again, who is one of the policy leads on the Green Home Grants for BEIS. For those of you who didn't join the first session, he did an incredible job of cracking through an enormous amount of questions already today. Over 150 questions were put forward. So if that's not a challenge, I don't know what is for this session. If you weren't able to join that first session, please do watch again on YouTube. So we know the team at BEIS are incredibly busy at the moment, understandably, but they were really keen to utilise Warm Homes Week to reach out to our networks to share more details about Green Home Grants and glean your feedback through this Q&A session. So thank you to BEIS and thank you to all of those who are joining us today. Before I hand over to Tom, I just have a couple of opening remarks, but I won't take up too much time because I appreciate we want to get to the Q&A session sooner rather than later. It'll come as no surprise that NEA really welcomes this much needed investment in energy efficiency. We've been advocating for large scale energy efficiency investment for our lifetime as an organisation, which in case it hasn't been mentioned enough times so far will be 40 years next year. We do recognise that Green Home Grants alone is not going to be sufficient in scale to tackle fuel poverty, but it certainly starts us on that journey and demonstrates a recognition that a green recovery will sit at the heart of us building back better. Inevitably, there's going to be some challenges, and those challenges can only really be worked through if we work together, and principally one of those challenges is, of course, timescales. We know that the scheme is time limited and there's a relatively short window overall, particularly when we're facing a backdrop of COVID-19 and delivery challenges associated with that. It's kind of more vital than ever, I guess, to work collaboratively to reach as many people as possible, particularly those in the greatest need, such as those struggling with health issues, living in private rented sector on low incomes, and particularly those that are digitally excluded, which I know was mentioned at the session earlier today. Secondly, and still linked to timescales in many senses, the current capacity of the existing supply chain will need to increase. We know there's a way to go to grow this capacity, and that will include a lot of training and skills development. For NEA particularly, it's really important to ensure that good quality energy advice is delivered as part of the scheme, particularly at the point of installation. We know from our health and innovation programme that kind of good quality energy advice does equal greater savings and enhances the comfort in the home, but the absence of that creates a risk that people will end up paying more or not use their systems effectively. And with the Green Home Grants rightly focusing on low carbon technology, helping and support our transition to net zero, I think we're probably all aware that there's a risk that by trying to deliver at pace, we could find ourselves failing consumers by providing insufficient accompanying support and advice. So it's really important that that doesn't happen. I would hope that I'm preaching to converted today anyway, but it's not as simple as leaving behind a manual, hoping the consumer makes good use of it. Transitioning to a new type of heating requires fundamental changes in behaviour. And without that, we risk customers paying more and or failing to maintain adequate warmth. So I suppose just in summary, before I hand over to Tom, NEA really hopes to see much greater focus on understanding vulnerability, particularly for that portion of the scheme, including understanding the need for behaviour change and clear energy advice in the home so that the support is accessible and tailored to the householder. A combination of these skills will hopefully mean that we can truly grasp this opportunity to make the most difference to those in the greatest need. In many ways, I suppose, kind of building on those skills, whilst it will require investment, it's also slightly easier than it has ever been before. We know that the majority of training providers, including NEA, have transitioned a lot of key training into online formats, which hopefully means that it is easier to kind of build on those skills and develop those skills within your workforce. Anyway, ultimately, we hope that today's session will give you a lot more insight and information about the scheme. And we, as I say, we really do hope that you can make the most use of the Q&A. So now, without further ado, I hand over to Tom to start his presentation.
Thanks, Danny. So I think hopefully everyone can see the screen I'm sharing. And apologies for those who attended the earlier session. A few of the slides at the start will be similar by way of an introduction to the policy, but I guess I'll be speaking to them with a focus on the supply chain, and the rest of the presentation then sort of takes us in that direction towards considerations of the supply chain and installer base for the policy as well. Just by way of background, on the 8th of July, the Chancellor, as part of the Southern Economic Statement, announced the Green Homes Grant, a £2 billion package, of which 1.5 billion will be delivered this financial year through a demand-led voucher scheme, where consumers will apply, receive a voucher, and then be able to use this to support energy efficiency and low carbon heating improvements to their home. The thinking behind this, and I guess where the policy fits within the overall government strategy, is it's a key flanking the post-COVID recovery and plans to kickstart the economy. And it also plays a key part in the role in the fight against climate change due to the proportion of emissions, current emissions that are attributed to the household energy and household heating. We're also hoping this will boost the green economy, supporting a large number of jobs, over 80,000 in the sector, and deliver energy efficiency improvements and build savings to more than 600,000 homes in England. So in terms of how it will work, households, homeowners and landlords can apply for a voucher towards the cost of installing energy efficient and low carbon heating improvements in their home. The main voucher scheme, I guess the element that's probably got the most attention, will cover 2/3 of the cost of qualifying improvements to homes of customers, and the maximum value of the voucher, the contribution that government will make, is £5,000. For qualifying customers on a number of income related and disability related benefits, they can see 100% of the cost covered up to a maximum of £10,000 for improvements. So in terms of how the installable fit into that, and importantly how reimbursement and payment will fit in, once the works are completed and completed to the satisfaction of customers, installer will request and receive payment from the government for the 2/3 element if it's the main voucher scheme, or the full cost if it's the low income element. And just moving on to discuss a bit more about the types of measures that are involved and the types of measures that are eligible. We've split the scheme to consider primary measures and then secondary measures, and I'll say a little bit more about how those two things fit together. So for customers to participate in the scheme, they need to install at least one primary measure. So this covers a range of insulation measures, so solid wall, cavity wall, underfloor, and room in roof insulation, but also a number of forms of low carbon heating installation, so air source heat pump, ground source heat pump, solar thermal and biomass boilers. And we'll be saying a little bit more about the types of technologies which may be somewhere in between or combinations of these broad categories, and providing more detailed guidance on how those things will qualify in the next couple of weeks as we get onto scheme launch. Moving on to secondary measures. So once a customer has installed a primary measure, they can also use a voucher to help cover the cost of secondary measures. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated, but the secondary measure, the amount of contribution there is capped and can't exceed the subsidy and support that's provided for the primary measures. So I guess a good example would be if somebody is seeking insulation where the government is contributing £2,500, and that's a primary measure, they could use the rest of the value of the voucher, £2,500 of additional government support, to cover secondary measures. So that could be installing double glazing where it's replacing or additional to single glazing, or upgrading to an energy efficient door, plus some combination of heating controls or hot water tank thermostats there as well. So that's how the secondary measures fit in. So we've designed this to try and ensure the maximum benefits for bill savings, CO2 reductions, and thermal benefits to consumers, and that's informed the measures that fit into primary or secondary measures as well. So we'll be setting out in more detail here which types of the regulations and which types of windows and doors will be eligible. For now, we set out the broad terms based on building regs around doors where they're replacing those that were installed before 2002, but we'll update it with more detailed information ahead of scheme launch. But for now, that's good as a general guide. We've also, on the 28th of August, set out initial guidance on the types of supporting works that will be covered or won't be covered to support installation of these energy efficiency and low carbon heating measures. So in terms of items that won't be covered for the scheme, to give a bit of a guideline here, something where we're building a new extension or converting your home, these vouchers can't be used towards covering part of the cost of that. They can't be used towards, say, insulating an extension or a conservatory with no fixed heating. or an outbuilding, or an extension without planning permission in place. They can't be used for installing a new fossil fuel heating system, and they can't be used for replacement double glazing or replacing an already energy efficient door, or for installing solar PV for electricity generation or storage. So in terms of backdating, that's not something that can be covered for the scheme. So people can't use these vouchers to pay for works that were carried out prior to them being issued. And although we're covering the full breadth of residential properties, or a wide range of them, they can't be used for works in a new build property that has not previously been occupied. Okay. So in terms of eligibility for the supply chain to get involved, so to ensure high standards with the installations, we're requiring installers to be certified to carry out the work to properties. For energy efficiency installations, this will mean traders must be Trustmark registered and then certified to PAS 2030 standards for the requisite measures. For low carbon heating, we're looking at Trustmark registration and then certification through the microgeneration certification scheme. So across the certification bodies for the different elements and the different measures, these must be UCAS accredited bodies, accredited with the UK Accreditation Service. Okay, so in terms of the installer journey and the route to certification. So if you're an existing member of a body, maybe a Trustmark scheme provider or existing certification body, you can apply to register for Trustmark through their website, or in many cases through your certification body. And we've seen a large number of applications already that are coming to Trustmark directly, but also that are coming through bodies such as scheme providers under Trustmark. Where the certain criteria are met, this registration can be completed and onboarding can take place within 5 working days. And we're working towards ensuring that the pipeline of applications that's been building up, and applications so far is being dealt with as quickly as possible. We've got the right capacity, both in the scheme providers and certification bodies, but also at Trustmark to process those as quickly as possible. When the company or tradesperson in question is a new applicant to a certification body, they can identify a suitable scheme for them and for the measures that they might be interested in installing via the Trustmark website. And from there, they can be passed on to the scheme for onboarding registration. Or where an experienced business is signing up to a scheme provider, this can be completed within 12 working days, followed by Trustmark registration within 5 working days. In the case where business needs to gain certification, either MCS or PAS certification for the relevant energy efficiency measure, the timescales that we're aware of, talking to industry and working with stakeholders, are typically 6 to 12 weeks, followed again by the Trustmark registration process. Again, this process can depend on the level of experience that a business or tradesperson has got in that measure, and any preparation they need to make to be ready for certification. So once certified, a business will register as an approved installer on the Trustmark website. Businesses that are already registered are part of the directory of certified installers on the Simple Energy Advice website. So already, and this functionality was launched at the end of August, consumers can look on the Simple Energy Advice website, provide details of their property. The database can look towards see if there's a energy performance certificate associated with the property, and then build up recommendations around measures that they might want to install through the Green Homes Grant Scheme. Through that service, once consumers have developed a plan or a package for their home or ideas about what measures they want to pursue, they can then see a list of certified installers for those relevant measures to get in touch with them and arrange for quotes to be made. Once someone has applied for a voucher, that voucher will be made, the application will be made with details of the quotes and the sorts of measures they're interested in installing as part of that application. So we're asking that customers are prepared and have decided what combination of measures they want, which installers they're wishing to seek to provide those. Doesn't have to be the same installer for all measures, and then makes their application, which will contain the name of the tradesperson or business selected to carry out the work. After the work is completed, government will reimburse installers for the portion of costs that are not met by consumers, either 2/3 or up to 2/3, or the full cost if people are applying for the low income scheme, subject to the terms and conditions being met, and this will be set out. Further details on these will be set out ahead of the scheme launch. And we're hoping to minimise disruption. We could really focus on keeping this time period between completion of the work, confirmation that it's been completed to factory standards, and then redemption and reimbursement of suppliers to narrow that window down as short as possible. In terms of some of the benefits of the scheme, we're hoping that this will bring forward a lot of demand for energy efficiency improvements that people may have been thinking about or putting off for a bit of time, and the level of support that's being offered through the scheme will motivate high levels of engagement across the country. But we're also hoping that this will set, and other policy levers will be hoping to announce and make progress on during this period of time, because we're aware that this is a challenging ask for industry. Will also provide greater confidence to the supply chain, but also consumers, about the direction of decarbonisation in the household sector, to encourage people to participate and make use of it, both for consumers to bring forward and build appetite for the measures, but also in the supply chain to invest, train and recruit with the confidence that the demand will be there beyond, both up to this financial year, but also beyond that, that the signals will be giving. We'll also be shortly announcing details of a supply chain competition, which will be inviting bids for training and skills packages, both across the range of energy efficiency and low carbon measures across industry, but also covering things like certification costs to longer term training commitments. And we'll be inviting bids from trade associations, educational institutions, and a range of bodies to put together compelling bids to receive funding through that mechanism. And we'll be announcing that competition over the next week. So in terms of other benefits we hope the scheme can offer, again, referencing the sort of challenging timescales that's been put to us from some of you, and was mentioned at the start of the presentation. I think we're seeing this as a department. We've been challenged. All this challenge has been put to us to make a success of this policy, and that being a strong message to the Chancellor and across government that this scheme should be continued. We should continue to give these strong signals, and that we can therefore seek a more long-lasting package through the spending review process to build up further demand and support for decarbonisation and energy efficiency improvements. And that's how we're hoping to show strong deployment of measures, strong uptake of the supply chain, and that will be the sort of strong message that we can take to ministers and government, that this scheme should be extended or continued in some form, and that we should continue to give these strong signals to the market about direction and the speed at which we want to decarbonise the housing system. Okay. So I'm happy to stop there and get on to engage with hopefully a good number of questions. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was brilliant. Again, for the second presentation, well done. And we do have a few questions that are coming through, but keep them coming through, everybody, because we've only had a few so far. I've got a way to go to the 150 mark. So there's been a couple of questions relating to blocks of flats. So the principal question is, how will the voucher process work for blocks of flats regarding cavity wall insulation? So for example, in a 3-storey block where the freehold is owned or managed by a property management company, and there are 9 flats in the block with some residents and some private renting, can we liaise with the property management company to claim the vouchers for each flat to carry out the wall insulation for the whole block?
Yeah, so I think we're aware that these are, these present additional challenges, these forms of ownership. Our ambition is this is eligible for different forms of ownership, so leasehold, shared ownership, but aware that that means and presents additional challenges for households around arranging the necessary permissions. So we want to provide sort of guidance into those permissions, but it will be to support, grouped applications, say, building with mixed forms of ownership, or where there's a distinct folder covering a range of properties. But
Tom, right, just a quickie, your sound's going.
Problem,
yeah. We may need to turn off videos if the streaming is starting to go. Sorry, did you want to try and take that question again? Apologies, Tom, because it's cut out towards the last bit.
Sure, that's fine. I've turned off my video, but just let me know if it's
fantastic.
That's out again. Sorry. So yeah, we're hoping to design the ensure the application process and the guidance we set out, further guidance we set out, helps mixed forms of ownership or buildings where there are mixed forms of ownership, and that sort of example given of the block of flats with a separate freeholder to allow them to navigate and participate in the scheme. Although this will require, I guess, the consent and participation of the freeholder. So it may be that when if there is a sort of reluctance or difficulty in sort of contacting or getting their agreement to participate in the scheme, that will be a barrier to participation. So we're trying to sort of smooth and reduce those, but we can't guarantee it's going to be moved in all cases. And then we may be looking for other levers across government to try and reach out to those and capture those areas where it's more difficult to get measures through and applications through the Green House system and Green House scheme in the future.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. A question came in earlier, but actually I think you've addressed it in your presentation, but there's a supplementary one. So somebody was asking around how the voucher will work from a cash flow perspective. So who will the money get paid to? And appreciate you've clarified that it will get paid to the installer. I guess the kind of supplementary question to that is the timescales for payment. So what do you anticipate will be the turnaround time for reimbursing installers once they've made that claim?
Yeah, so I think as part of our invitation to tender for potential,
the internet's going a bit funny again, I'm afraid, Tom. Sorry, everybody. I'm going to turn off my video. See if it helps. Tom, can you try and... Tom, I'm afraid we can't hear you at all at the moment. Really sorry. I'm not sure if there's anything.
But yeah, we're doing all we can to sort of mitigate and keep that window as short as possible. But we're aware of the challenges that present in terms of reimbursements and being paid for the condition of work.
Tom, I'm really sorry, but again, I don't know if everybody else is having the same problem or if it's just me, but I can't hear you at all. Could the fellow panelists let me know if it is just me or if it's Tom's? Same issue. Okay, so we're all struggling to hear you, I'm afraid, Tom, which means that we can't hear any of your answers. Bear with us, everybody. Hopefully we'll be able to get a bit better connectivity shortly. Thanks, everybody. I'm getting lots of feedback on the chat telling me that nobody can hear you. So thanks, everybody. We couldn't hear you then. Could you try again?
Yeah, sorry, I've come out and rejoined. So this was regarding the question about sort of reimbursement still, yeah?
Fantastic. Yep, can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. So I guess what we put in our invitation to tender is that one of the requirements on any commercial partner to help us deliver the scheme is that we need to keep the window for reimbursement as short as possible. So once the quality of the measures and the confirmation of completion has been confirmed with the customer, we're hoping to keep that window within a few days for reimbursement, because we're aware that this presents a cash flow and liquidity challenge for supply chain to be waiting for reimbursement. So yeah, the ambition is that in nearly all cases that will be made within a few days.
Fantastic, thank you. Are installers going to be expected to provide quotes for works free of charge? Will there be any reimbursement for quotes?
Yeah, so I guess we're aware that there's been a bit of feedback to us that at the moment, either because of the levels of demand they're seeing, or concern about the nature of the invitations to quote that suppliers are being offered, that they're asking for some cost or some fee to be paid for quotes, and that may then be reimbursed if people go ahead with the measures or make a voucher application. I think we're aware partly that represents the sort of strain and the efforts the supply chain are meeting to recruit and scale up for the level of demand they're anticipating. But we're also aware we need to think about how that fits into the application process as well. So my understanding and expectation is that if somebody and they're asked to pay a fee for that, if there is a application for a voucher that follows, and if they paid for that quote, they won't be eligible to get they won't be able to get a refund directly through the application for the quote. But if, for example, they paid for a quote, the installer then made an application. The installer could then make an arrangement with the consumer to refund them for that portion of the money spent on the quotes prior to the application. If they made that separate arrangement, and then the full cost of the work could be sort of reimbursed through the voucher scheme. But it's one we'll be able to set out exactly in the terms and conditions for the policy. But our hope is, our ideal is that quotes are provided without an upfront cost. But it is possible for installers and customers to make other arrangements for reimbursing cost of quotes as well.
Fantastic, thanks, Tom. I don't think you covered this, but apologies if you did cover this in your presentation. What will be the situation where a house has cavity wall insulation which may be wet and possibly not been installed properly in the first place? Can solid wall, or should not have been installed in the first place? Can solid wall insulation be applied for alongside the removal of said wet CWI? Would that be permissible?
Yeah, so I think we try to set initial guidance on the sort of supporting works that would be covered and wouldn't be covered by the voucher. So in terms of sort of reasonable enabling work, we think to support the retrofit. So this could be repairing and treating damp, necessary structural improvements, and we'll be setting out more detail on what that could pertain to in this example of removing insulation that's been poorly installed before. So those sorts of things, there is the scope for those elements to be covered, but we'll be setting out further detail on exactly to what extent that sort of supporting work will be can be covered and cost reimbursed for the voucher scheme.
Fantastic. Are hybrid heat pumps allowed under the primary measures?
So at the moment we've set out inclusion for as I sort of mentioned, biomass, solar thermal, air source and ground source heat pumps, but we will be providing further clarity on the types of sort of variants or hybrids between those categories, plus other categories that might be eligible, and which ones will be excluded in the next few days.
Fantastic. If a voucher is issued and not used by a customer, will the value of the voucher be put back into the pot, or will it be effectively lost? I assume it would go back in to the pot because you wouldn't have technically paid out the money, but
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think it's likely that the voucher will be offered once it's applied and granted. We'll have a sort of time limit on it, which could be 3 months, for example. And if it then is not reimbursed within that time, then it sort of goes back into the pot as well. But our sort of operating approach is probably that we're going to be we've got some information about how we expect demand to sort of flow through over the course of the period of the time the scheme is open for. and we'll be factoring some assumptions about uptake and what the sort of conversion rate is between applications and measures installed. So we don't anticipate any time at which applications are being refused because there's too many. There's already been the full value allotted in the system. If we think that a number of those, a small proportion of those are not going to materialise into measures being installed.
Fantastic. We've had a couple of comments actually come through regarding the Simple Energy Savings Advice website, and I guess a couple of concerns around its limitations. Also a recognition that BEIS have taken on board a number of industry concerns more recently, so an appreciation of that. But in terms of ongoing feedback, how should industry channel back their feedback regarding the site? And also a supplementary question, can the voucher cover the cost of advice work from a retrofit advisor or coordinator? Which I know you covered in session 1, but would appreciate you repeating for this session.
Sure, yeah, so on Simple Energy Advice website already, any sort of feedback on information that we're getting out there through Simple Energy Advice or gov.uk. There is a mailbox we can give the details of, which is, I'll send out the precise details, but it's vouchers.project@beis.gov.uk. So that's one route for us to, where we're sort of routinely monitoring and acting on feedback through that. Otherwise, it's possible to feed that back to me, and we've got a process where we're regularly reviewing and updating and trying to action some of these improvements that people are flagging for the Simple Energy Advice website, because we're aware that it's an improvement and it was a big enhancement to the service we were able to get out there at the end of August. But there are a few bugs and user issues which we're sort of still working through as well. Plus providing greater detail on the and greater variety about the types of measures, the types of, say, insulation, the materials covered, because we're aware that these things, as well as these things moving on, we need to make sure that the SEA website reflects the sort of latest offering that's out there in the market for consumers as well. In terms of I guess retrofit assessments, what we have said is that in terms of the sort of items that won't be covered by the voucher, and I think there was so we sort of said if building surveys are not going to be linked to retrofit, or these designs, EPCs, etc., are not linked to retrofit, they won't be covered. But we have suggested that and clarified that under sort of reasonable work and reasonable supporting works we think would be covered by the voucher would be modelling to estimate payback, evaluate the moisture risk, design drawings and calculations, structural engineer costs, and those sorts of things. You can see the types of assessments and preparatory work that would be covered by the voucher, but we'll be setting out further detail on that ahead of the scheme launch in the next week or two.
Fantastic, thank you. What checks are in place or going to be in place against duplication of measures from other schemes, i.e. eco? There's a comment, there's been many misunderstandings around things like room in the roof insulation versus loft insulation. So just wondering what checks might be in place.
Yeah, so I think we've got I guess it's maybe just worth clarifying how the different schemes might work together. So it's possible to participate both in the Green Homes Grant Scheme and, say, the Renewable Heat Incentive. But what would happen if you got participate in the Green Homes Grant Scheme and then wanted to make use of the Renewable Heat Incentive, payments for the RHI would be you'd have your Green Homes Grant contribution deducted from those payments. But you could use Green Homes Grant for energy efficiency improvements and then later use the renewable RHI for low carbon heating. That would be okay. In terms of sort of covering, it's okay for a household to get benefit of some measures through, say, eco or another scheme, and then also participate in the scheme. But what we can't have is obviously the risk in terms of sort of fraud and abuse of the scheme is that the same measure is compensated for twice through both schemes. And that will be part of the sort of fraud checks that we're making of any application. So we've got access to the relevant databases for the different schemes, the measures installed and their location, and we'll be making the sort of requisite checks against those to minimise the risk of purposeful or accidental issue areas where sort of measures are going to be applied for, or people are seeking compensation through multiple schemes for the same measure.
Brilliant, thank you. This may not be one for you, but I'll ask it anyway. Maybe one more for Trustmark. But how will an installation managing agent navigate Trustmark when using suppliers?
Sorry, Danny, can you just say that one again?
So in terms of so a managing agent for installers, I assume they mean sort of a scheme manager. How would they navigate Trustmark when using different suppliers? I might suggest that we could field this to direct to Trustmark, but unless you've got an answer to that one, Tom.
So I guess I'm just trying to think. Is this so? The issue here is not, I guess, somebody making an application with several installers in mind. It's more about if there's a sort of a company that's managing subcontractors and the company is Trustmark registered. Is that right? I'm just trying to understand.
I've only got very limited context, I'm afraid, but if needed, we can always ask the person to provide a bit more context, and we can ask it again a bit later.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll try and answer sort of both versions now, and then follow up if there's any more detail provided. So applications can cover several different companies. So if either because of availability in their local area or just preference, an applicant wants to make use of several different installers, one for insulation, one for low carbon heat, or even different ones for different types of insulation, that's their choice. That's fine. And the voucher, as long as they provide details of the quotes for the requisite bits of their application in the application, that can be approved for several installers. We'll also be making arrangements so that the sort of commercial confidentiality and sort of commercial sensitivities are managed. So, if, for example, a consumer is applying for 2 different measures with 2 different installers, those installers only see the information relevant for their bit of that application. So they're not finding out, it could be pricing or it could be any other information about the other part of that, the other installer in that application. On the question, I guess, of almost sort of a company that might have a relationship with subcontractors, the application, when somebody looks on the Simple Energy Advice website, that lists the companies that are, I guess, Trustmark registered and have been certified. So as long as a company has sort of registered with the scheme, if they're the sort of managing, if they're sort of overseeing the work or the retrofit project for the home, they can then oversee the relationships with various subcontractors, and then the compensation and reimbursement would go to that sort of overseeing company, who would then make reimbursements to subcontractors. There would need to be, to conform with PAS or MCS, there would need to be the requisite certifications and sort of demonstrations of experience across those different installers and tradespeople involved. But yeah, that relationship could be managed between Trustmark and the sort of managing agent. If that helps to answer that question.
Fantastic, thanks, Tom. I think that does give the clarity needed. Just in during the last session, you mentioned that the contractor will claim the voucher on behalf of the homeowner, and I think we've echoed that today. But would you mind confirming who claims the voucher where a public body authority undertakes the works, i.e. in its own housing stock?
Yeah, so I think that one would be, if we're talking about a sort of local authority or housing association or sort of company that's a landlord, they could make the application in the name of that relevant company or local authority, and they would be the sort of named person on the application, or whoever has whatever officer within those organisations is making the application on their behalf. As long as we've got a unique identifier for the sort of I guess the ultimate owner, we can then ensure that any grouped applications are not violating any caps on funds that can be passed on to any individual. So there are some potential state aid considerations and caps whereby there might be a maximum level of award we can give to any one homeowner or any one landlord. But yeah, those organisations can make the applications, and we'll be assessing them on, in line with those sort of state aid caps for those organisations.
Just before we go on to the next question, I'm going to go back to the block of flats. I've had a couple of comments in the chat explaining that your sound went very wobbly during those two questions. Remember, okay, back at the very beginning around cavity wall insulation, and firstly whether wet cavity wall insulation can be resourced through the scheme, and also kind of responsibility for versus leaseholder versus freeholder, and who takes responsibility for kind of claiming the vouchers, etc. Would you be able to kind of cover that off again, Tom? Apologies.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, on the I guess bad installation or bad installations previously, yeah, we're expecting the sort of enabling work or supporting work for a retrofit. So whether that's repairing and treating damp, removing infiltration, and any necessary structural improvements could be covered by the voucher. So putting those things right could be covered, but we need to set out, and we're aware we need to clarify that and go beyond, what we've described as reasonable enabling work, and those sort of bullet points we set out to give more detail. But yes, we'd hope that in lots of cases that would be covered when you're dealing with failures of insulation previously, and putting those right. On different types of ownership, our ambition is that the application scheme will help different types of ownership, say in the same building, to combine to ensure cost-effective measures, but also help them to navigate and explain the sorts of permissions they might need from any relevant freeholders as well, to open this up as widely as we can and get as many types of ownership, types of property through, because we're also aware that in those sorts of buildings is where we can see some of the most cost-effective improvements as well. But this will require, this will have to require consent and participation of the freeholder, depending on what permissions the leasehold offers the leaseholder. So we can't guarantee that the involvement or that permission will be forthcoming, and that's something we'll need to look towards with other policy levers we're looking to enhance and to roll out over the next few months on the say more on the regulatory side. But we're hoping to make it as easy as possible for different combinations and forms of ownership to participate.
Brilliant. So subject to kind of obviously those permissions, the principle would be that a freeholder could, or freeholder and leaseholder combined, could aggregate any vouchers associated with each of the flats to then put cavity wall insulation on the whole block.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. In signing off the work, you had mentioned earlier that different measures might need different signing off procedures. This may be a bit of a work in progress currently, Tom, but is there anything you can expand on that particular point?
Yeah, so I guess the sort of checks and balances once the work's completed, is helpful to sort of clarify those a bit more.
Yes,
so we've got a I guess series of checks that will be completed for any I guess at the start completed on any company or tradesperson that's participating. So as well as the certification that they can perform installations to the right standard, there are also a number of checks that try to ensure that the companies and tradespeople that can participate have got a certain level of establishment within the industry. So it might be around sort of company history and financial history, to try and prevent any sort of rapid entrance and levers into the market and the risk that might bring to consumers. But that sort of trustmark registration plus the certification, we're hoping, means the standard of the background and sort of average standard across the installer body is going to be high. But once the works are undertaken, there will be checks made at the desk of the scheme administrator and by bays to ensure that work's been completed, checking with consumers and installers. There will also be on-site inspections and checks for the quality of the work, so not just confirming that the measures have been done, but also confirming, for example, if we're talking about insulation across several walls, that all that's been done, the supporting works have been undertaken, and also that the work has been done to the required standard, and there aren't faults associated with it. For some measures, that will be the case that all measures are checked on site. For some, it might be a proportion of measures that are checked rather than the entirety, and that would depend on the risk, both of the that sort of measure, how risky we think it is, how complicated we think it is, but also the type of property and our assessment of risk for that particular application as well. So those are the sorts of on-site checks we're anticipating. Once those have been confirmed and issues have either not been flagged or have been addressed, that's when compensation to the installer would be made, and only then.
Thank you. The next one is around, I know we've touched on eco, but questions coming around integration with the renewable heat incentive and how the scheme will operate in tandem with RHI.
Yeah, so I think it's, I mentioned a bit that you can participate in both, and I guess what we'd say is that one of the benefits of the Green Homes Grant, additional benefits, is that it can help towards the upfront costs in quite a, in a big way, and it operates in a slightly different way to the RHI for that. So therefore, if somebody wants to get the sort of upfront support of the Green Homes Grant, they can apply for the voucher, get the measure installed, but they could at a later date then apply for the RHI. What would happen is, though, that the overall level of payments for their RHI that they'd expect, you'd have the level of Green Homes Grant support deducted from that, and that would be the way of sort of balancing that out and ensuring that the same measure isn't sort of covered or compensated twice. It will also be possible for it will be sort of managing then, I guess, the database of RHI installations against the database of Green Homes Grant installations to understand and sort of manage that overlap and ensure that the same measures, when people are trying to participate in both, that those deductions are being made, but will be also be part of the terms and conditions will ensure that people are aware that they can't sign up for both, and that any Green Homes Grant payment would be deducted from their RHI payments if they wanted to go through the RHI at a later date.
Great, and apologies if I'm repeating myself. It turns out I'm not as good at multitasking as I had hoped I was. So the next one is back to the checks and that will be put in place. There's a specific question, obviously I know you've talked about the checks kind of at length already, but a specific question around whether they will be looking to confirm that the PAS standards have been achieved, or whether there might be a kind of a deeper kind of evaluation or monitoring assessment of a proportion of the measure installations. So if that's the case, what might be the percentage of those checks, and who would be organising that?
Yeah, so I can't tell you. Don't want to tell you the exact percentage. Because obviously this is part of our. I was going to say we need to keep a few things close to our chest, because it's information that could be useful for anyone trying to look to game the system or any potential fraudster. But yeah, I think, as I said, I think for some measures it's going to be all of them, and for some where they're deemed lower risk, or it could even be based on the risk associated with the property. If we think it's a sort of more straightforward package of measures that are being installed, that the proportions then might be lower. But in terms of who will be carrying out those checks, it will be depending on the check. There's a role for Trustmark, but there's also a role for Davies and our sort of partner scheme administrator as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that there is a question around the expectation of customer contribution. I guess that will vary depending on the customer and the price of the work. So somebody's asked about how installers would be expected to front upfront costs if there was any need for a customer contribution. One would assume, and I don't know, again, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but if there is a need for customer contribution, then the customer would be expected to pay that within a timescale that was acceptable to the installer, probably not necessarily thinking about the low income strand, but more the more able to pay strand. Would that be a fair sort of assumption?
Yeah, so I think the normal sort of time frames would apply. If you were getting some form of insulation now, at what point you arrange to make payment of that would depend on, your arrangement with the installer and what their expectations are and how that meets yours, whether that's some portion of it up front and some on completion or all at completion. We'd expect those arrangements basically to tide over, but obviously it would just be for the proportion of cost that you're covering. So it'd just be say a third of the cost, or maybe a bit more if the total cost of the measures is above the cap for government contributions. So that's the sort of arrangement we anticipate, but we'll probably say a little bit more about that with the terms and conditions. But it's not something I think we're going to be too fixated upon, and I think we think the normal sort of procedures, reasonable procedures would apply there.
Fantastic. And I think we might be coming towards the end of the current questions, which you're probably exhausted already, Tom. Back to the flats part of it. Can the property management companies claim the voucher on behalf of the flat?
So I think it needs to, yeah. So I think that's a good point. I think they'll have a role. That's one we'll probably need to, we'll be providing further clarity on. But in terms of who applies for the voucher, it would need to be, I think, a combination of, it would need to make reference to the various leaseholders in the properties that are covered in that case, but also include details for the freeholder as well. So it's probably, I can't say exactly at the moment, who would you then say the voucher application is coming from, because it's essentially coming from a group of sort of beneficial leaseholders and the freeholder. So that's probably one where we'll provide that more detailed guidance. But I don't think I'd be saying that the voucher was coming from or being made by the sort of property management company in that case. It would I still probably say it was coming from the combination of them plus the leaseholders as well, if they're doing a sort of combined application.
Okay, and then just a couple more questions before we can start to wrap up. Are there any location limitations for installers in relation to where their customers are based?
No, so as long as the customers are based in England, so as long as the household is in England, installers can be, in the constituent nations of the UK, and I guess they could be further afield if they are, if they've got the right certification and are registered with Trustmark. So yeah, that's sort of the location of potential installers can be broader than the location of eligible households. Yeah. Brilliant.
And can the funding be claimed alongside other funding such as building safety programme funding?
Yeah, that one's a new question. So that's a good one to sort of take away and make sure that's captured in the T's and C's. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. Yeah, that's maybe one we've got to clarify in the T's and C's.
Not to worry, Tom. No, that's fine. Thank you. I'm going to try turning on my video. Not that any of you really need to see my face, but hopefully it will stream. Just to the couple of concluding comments. And firstly, kind of thank you, Tom, especially. Thank you for all of your efforts with answering those questions. I think you've done a tremendous job. And thank you all of the delegates today for sending in those questions. We hit 50 questions, so unfortunately we weren't near the 150 mark, but never mind. There were still some good challenging questions for Tom and some to take away. We will run all of those questions off and send them to Bay so they can use them to inform sort of further details going forward. We obviously know that the delivery of this scheme is going to be a challenge, but it's one that we really do want to make the most of. It's going to make a real difference to people's lives. It's going to support us with our ambitions towards net zero, increase employment opportunities, and most importantly, support us with tackling fuel poverty and hopefully us demonstrating good delivery of this scheme will lead to greater investment in the future, and that's obviously what we're all hoping for. So I really hope you've enjoyed today's session, and once again, thank you for joining us. We really hope that you're joining the rest of Warm Homes Week. We've got a session on fuel poverty and decarbonising heat tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. If you've not already registered, please do so on our website. Thanks again all, and take care. Enjoy your evenings.